Thank you very much, Sir David, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Keatsians, all of you, for being here on this wonderful bicentenary celebration of the life and the achievement of John Keats. It's my pleasure to speak to you this evening, and I'm honoured to be able to do so. As Sir David said, this evening marks the culmination of many years of Keatsian activities to celebrate the poet's bicentenaries over the last 5 years and more. And before I begin, there are some debts of thanks that I'd like to acknowledge. Keats Foundation was founded 11 years ago to support creative Keats-oriented activities at Keats House, Hampstead. And I want to start by thanking the Keats Foundation Board of Trustees, Bob Hall, Tony Griffiths, Peter Phillips, Simon Taylor, and Judith Palmer, as well as former trustees Ashley Goodall and Anne Rowe. Over the years, Keats Foundation has organised readings and talks, performances and videos, an annual Keats conference, and a lecture. All of this has been achieved in collaboration with the Keats House, Hampstead, and I want to salute in particular Rob Shakespeare and Ken Page and the team at Keats House for initiating and energising the highly successful Keats 200 programme of bicentenary events, to which this evening is a kind of gala contribution. I want to acknowledge the invaluable support of Judith Palmer and her colleagues at the Poetry Society, and also the interest and involvement of Giuseppe Albano, the curator of the Keats Shelley House at Rome. As we meet this evening to celebrate and remember John Keats's genius as a poet, it's an appropriate moment to announce the launch of a Keats Foundation Keats 200 partnership appeal to fund a bust of John Keats to be located at Moorgate, on that area of open ground just beside the Globe Keats Bar. Please see the leaflet for further information about this project, to place what will be the first memorial of John Keats in his native city of London. And please do indicate your interest in this project on the little slip provided at the bottom of the handout. I also wish to thank City of London Corporation for hosting this evening's celebrations, and the University of St Andrews for so much over the years. You're not going to hear much about John Keats in this lecture until I get into the second half of it. So if we're about 20 minutes in and I see people whispering at the back saying he's not talking about John Keats, he's not talking about John Keats, I will. I will get to John Keats once I've looked at some hinterland that are going to set out my reading of Keats's life and career in the second half of the talk. I'm interested in Keats's comment to Shelley in August 1820, just before he got on the boat to sail to Naples. He said to Shelley, "I must either voyage or journey to Italy as a soldier marches up to a battery." And he said the same thing in a letter to his publisher. I'm interested in Keats's links with the military and how militarism in some ways shaped and inflected his career as a poet. And I'm starting with his father, Thomas Keats. All that we know about Thomas Keats can be summarized in a single word: nothing, or next to nothing. We have a few details about his appearance, about his marriage and married life, and his work in a city livery stable. There are some notes of evidence that he gave in a case of horse theft at the Old Bailey, that survive in the Old Bailey archives. And there are also newspaper reports of his death in a riding accident in April 1804, and the notes of the inquest that followed. And this is what you can see here. Being riding on a certain horse, it so happened that the said Thomas Keats accidentally, casually, and by misfortune fell from the said horse down to and against the ground, whereby he received a mortal bruise in and upon his head. So in view of the scanty information that we have about John Keats' father, any additions to our knowledge are potentially of significance. And my bicentenary talk this evening offers one such detail and reflects on how it adds to our knowledge and may advance our understanding of John Keats' sense of himself and of his calling as a poet. Most of what we know about Thomas Keats can be traced to the remarkably disagreeable memoranda of the Keats family drawn up by the poet's publisher John Taylor in 1827. This was based on a conversation with Richard Abbey, who, as you'll know, was one of the guardians of the Keats children after their parents' early deaths. Abbey remembered that Thomas Keats was a helper in John Jennings's livery stables at the Swan and Hoop, Moorfields, and that Thomas had the honour to be united to his master's daughter. The marriage of Thomas Keats and Frances Jennings took place not in this locality, but at St. George's in Hanover Square on the 9th of October 1794. That the couple chose a fashionable church in London's West End, not a local church near Moorfields, may reflect the couple's social ambitions, a matter to which we'll return in a few minutes. Somewhat oddly, Abbey mentioned to John Taylor the danger of being alone with Miss Jennings. And Taylor was the first of many to speculate that more may have been involved. I looked, Taylor tells us, I looked to see if I could discern any of the lineaments of the young poet in Mr. Abbey's features. Certainly Abbey's disparaging account of Thomas Keats could suggest a lasting resentment. According to Abbey, John Keats's father did not possess or display any great accomplishments. Elevated perhaps in his notions by the sudden rise of his fortunes, he thought it became him to act somewhat more the man of consequence than he had been accustomed to. But it was still in the way of his profession. He kept a remarkably fine horse for his own riding, and on Sundays would go out with others who prided themselves in the like distinction to Highgate, Highbury, or some other places of public entertainment for man and horse. At length, one Sunday night, he was returning with some of his jolly companions from a carouse at one of these places, riding very fast and most probably very much in liquor, when his horse leapt upon the pavement opposite the Methodist chapel in the City Road, and falling with him against the iron railings, so dreadfully crushed him that he died as they were carrying him home. Abbey portrays Thomas Keats as a young man who was conceited, extravagant, and drank too much. Yet, despite having no great accomplishments, Thomas had been successful, he was sociable, and evidently he was popular with his companions. 3 decades after his death, Abbey had not forgotten him. To balance Abbey's hostility, it's worth contrasting Charles Cowden Clarke's impressions of the poet's father. Clarke was Keats's schoolfellow at Enfield, so he had known him when he was a boy. He tells us that Keats's father was the principal servant at the Swan and Hoop, a man of so remarkably fine a common sense and native respectability that I perfectly remember the warm terms in which his demeanour used to be canvassed by my parents after he'd been to visit his boys. He was short of stature and well-knit in person. John resembled him both in make and feature, with brown hair and dark hazel eyes. He was killed by a fall from his horse in returning from a visit to the school. So it's difficult to reconcile Abbey's carousing upstart with Clarke's memory of the poet's father, sensible, respectable, dapper, and a devoted father. Whereas Clarke presented a carefully measured profile, Abbey's story of the rise and fall of Thomas Keats lingered over details of what would now be termed social mobility, notably the circumstance that Thomas thought it became him to act the man of consequence, but it was still in the way of his profession. He kept a remarkably fine horse. Now, in an era when horse ownership was a commonplace, hardly worth mentioning, that fine horse seems to have rankled because it embodied Thomas's elevation. That Thomas's horse leapt and falling with him crushed him may indicate that Abbey thought John Keats's father deserved such a downfall. But what exactly did Abbey mean when he claimed that Thomas acted the man of consequence, but it was still in the way of his profession? Evidently, Thomas Keats's elevation had been related to his employment in the horse trade. He continued as principal servant at the Swan and Hoop, taking over the business in 1802 when his father-in-law, John Jennings, retired. At this time, the City of London Corporation required anyone who kept a tavern, an inn, or a livery stable in the city to be a freeman of the Innholders' Company. And accordingly, Thomas Keats now took steps to establish himself by becoming a freeman of the Innholders' Company by redemption as a preliminary to purchasing his freedom of the City of London. And the minutes of the Innholders give us the details. And this is the document kept still in the Guildhall library, where we can read of Thomas Keats attending and requesting to be admitted to the freedom of the company by redemption, being about to purchase his freedom of the city. He was accordingly sworn and made free and paid £3 and 6p, and the officers' fees at 2 and 6p. That established Thomas as legally permitted to trade, and he promptly renamed his premises Keats's Livery Stables, and prospered there until his fatal accident on the night of Saturday, the 14th of April, 1804. So we can hear how Abbey had reason for remembering that Thomas Keats's marriage to Frances Jennings enabled him to advance himself, becoming a freeman of the Innholders and the city in the way of his profession. He was evidently ambitious and might now be described as an upwardly mobile achiever who had successfully turned circumstances to his advantage and moved up the social scale. He was evidently well known in London and beyond, and his death was reported in the Times, in the London Courier, in the Evening Mail, the Star, somewhat oddly in the Ipswich Journal, and in the Gentleman's Magazine. And I think, do we have this on here? No, we'll take that back. On Sunday, Mr. Keats, livery stable keeper in Moorfields, went to dine at Southgate. He returned at a late hour, and on passing down the city road, his horse fell with him when he had the misfortune to fracture his skull. It was at 1 a.m. when the watchman found him. He was at that time alive, but speechless. The watchman got assistance and took him to a house in the neighbourhood, where he died at about 8 o'clock in the morning. Thomas's funeral was held at St. Stephen's, Coleman Street, on Monday, the 23rd of April, and one might think that as he was lowered into the ground, his story had come to an end. As John Keats was well aware, however, his father's funeral occurred on a date traditionally associated with Shakespeare's birthday, creating a link between his father's demise and his own ambitious ascent as a poet under the guidance of his immortal presider, Shakespeare, of course, who also died on the 23rd of April. One day after Thomas's funeral, a belated report of his accident was published in the Weekly Dispatch. This account gives us some significant further details about him. Thomas Keats of Moorgate, a member of the London Volunteer Cavalry, was found early on Monday morning in the City Road with his skull dreadfully fractured. It's supposed that his horse had fallen with him. The horse was caught in Finsbury Square and by accident taken to Mr. Keats's own stables when his servant recognised the horse. Mr. Keats was then found near the artillery gates. He was conveyed home and died at 8 o'clock in the morning. He has left a wife and 5 children to lament his unfortunate death. So this appeared in the Weekly Dispatch 3 weeks after Thomas's accident, and it introduces, as you can see, several items of fresh information about him, most notably that he had enlisted in a regiment of the loyal London Volunteer Cavalry. More limited in significance is the detail that he was found near the artillery gates. That's the entrance to the Honourable Artillery Company headquarters and the artillery ground a few yards north of Keats's livery stables on the City Road. That Thomas left a wife and 5 children is a mistake, of course. Thomas and Frances certainly had 5 children, although little Edward Keats had died aged just 20 months. So Thomas's enlistment in the London Volunteer Cavalry helps us make sense of Abbey's grudging anecdote about his fine horse for his own riding, and that on Sundays he would go out with others who prided themselves in the like distinction to places of public entertainment for man and horse. The city newspapers frequently carried reports of London volunteers, including the Volunteer Cavalry, training at Highgate and at Highbury, where after a grand field day, they would retire to the Highbury Barn Tavern for refreshments. This is to show you the hinterland of Keats's livery stables. It was here, close to Bedlam, looking over Moorfields, and what would have been Finsbury Circus up here at a slightly later date, and there's the artillery ground up here where Thomas was supposedly found. I'll come to Mr. John Goldham of the London Volunteer Cavalry in a moment, but this is to give you an idea of the kind of thing that they got up to. It seems likely that on Sundays, Thomas participated in volunteer field day activities that concluded with a carouse. Newspapers observed that volunteers often came back drunk, and on one occasion a brawl amongst them resulted in a fatality. So if Thomas had been very much in liquor on the night of his unfortunate accident, as Abbey claimed, he was by no means the only volunteer in that condition. Now, Keats's childhood overlapped with the first phase of volunteering, which in turn coincided with the French Revolutionary Wars, 1794 to 1802. And that phase came to an end with the Peace of Amiens in 1802 through to May 1803. And during that year, the volunteer force was much reduced. And when the war resumed in 1803, Britain faced the whole force of France amid present crisis and expectation of danger. It's a bit like the present, isn't it, with the fishing crisis. Prime Minister Henry Addington sought a rapid reformation of the volunteer force, and the Levée en Masse Act of July 1803 drew in thousands of patriot sons of Britain. Among them, somewhat surprisingly, Leigh Hunt, the radical journalist who enlisted in the St. James Volunteers, and further north, William Wordsworth enlisted and indeed paraded in the Ambleside Corps. It was at this period that the London Volunteer Cavalry, consisting exclusively of gentlemen residing in or connected with the city, was raised. And I think Thomas Keats may well have enlisted at this moment. And the open ground of Moorfields, here, just opposite the Swan and Hoop, Keats's livery stable, the open ground of Moorfields was frequently used for the London Volunteer Cavalry, which amounted to a full 10 regiments by October of 1803. So all of this is the national and, as you can see, local backdrop to some of Keats's earliest years. Summer 1803 was the moment Mary Russell Mitford recalled as the great scarlet fever of England, when volunteering was the order of the day. The prevailing spirit fell in with exactly the national character: loyal, patriotic, sturdy and independent, very proud and a little vain, fond of excitement and not indifferent to personal distinction. Now, I think that matches Thomas Keats exactly. It also matches John Keats, the poet, pretty closely as well, as I'm going to try and suggest. The London Volunteer Cavalry uniform was a particular attraction. A blue coat with red facings and silver lace. We need to go on to Mr. Goldham, and maybe you can just see some of the colours in this coloured print of him. A blue coat with red facings and silver lace, white breeches, black riding boots, and a crested helmet. Members of the volunteer cavalry were respectable tradesmen, mechanics, stable keepers, and others who kept horses for work or pleasure. As the keeper of a livery stable, Thomas Keats fitted this profile, and as a volunteer cavalryman, he would, by convention, have been treated as a gentleman. In 1795, the Duke of Portland, the Home Secretary, had referred to the gentlemen of the volunteer cavalry. So, taken all together, the volunteer system was recognised as a means of furthering middle-class social ambitions, giving authority, prominence, and, as Abbey said, consequence to individuals who would otherwise have had little public status or influence. Sir Walter Elliot, you'll remember, the bankrupt baronet of persuasion, objected to the navy as a means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, and would doubtless have said much the same thing about local volunteers. When young Henry Hunt, a farmer, enlisted in the Wiltshire Volunteer Yeomanry Cavalry, he was reported as bearing the character of being one of the most powerful young men in the county, a reputation that some of his neighbours found irksome. When Henry Hunt left the cavalry after challenging Lord Bruce, the colonel, the gentlemen of that part of the county of Wilts were determined that Henry Hunt should be put down. Now remember Henry Hunt, he's going to reappear in a few moments. From marrying at the age of 21, in just 10 years, Keats's father had established himself sufficiently to join the volunteer cavalry. He was a loyalist, evidently enough. He was also socially ambitious, to the extent of having arrived on a level with Richard Abbey and John Jennings, who were both prominent figures in the commercial world of the City of London. In becoming a cavalryman, the principal servant at the Swan and Hoop stables had also acquired social cachet as a gentleman, to Abbey's lasting irritation. But how did Thomas's elevation in society, his accident and his death affect the life and the poems of his eldest son, John Keats, who had lived through all of this as a boy? First, it may explain John Keats's sense of himself as being socially a cut above the run of most people with whom he associated. His fellow student at Guy's Hospital, Henry Stevens, recalled John Keats, his fellow student, as gentlemanly in his manners, gentle and courteous in his manner to females, albeit with a good deal of pride and some conceit. He would walk and talk as one of the gods might be supposed to do when mingling with mortals. As a young man, Stevens had had some ambitions as a poet, but when he ventured to show Keats some verses, he seemed to think it presumption in me to attempt to head along the same pathway as himself, at however humble a distance. Perhaps Thomas Keats's social climbing helps to explain his son's sense of being set apart as a poet who was destined to gain great things under the guidance of a good genius or presider. That Keats, as a young medical student, used to dress a la Byron may have been more than affectation, for Keats genuinely aspired to join the aristocracy of the English poets. An essential item of Thomas's equipment would, of course, have been a sabre, similar to the blades brandished by Mr. John Golden in this terrifying image, demonstrating what was called the Austrian broadsword exercise, apparently. This may help us understand how, as a child at a livery stable, here they are at Hyde Park, and there is one of the Westminster Cavalry. I didn't have much luck finding a detailed image of the London Volunteer Cavalry, but you get the idea from this one. Here is a light cavalry sabre from 1796. As a child, Keats is said to have got hold of a naked sword and swore nobody should go out of the house, as recounted in Benjamin Haydon's well-known anecdote. It also explains why Edward Holmes, a schoolfellow at Enfield, recalled that such was Keats's penchant for fighting, anyone might easily have fancied he would become great, but rather in some military capacity than in literature. Now, it's usually been understood that Keats was emulating his uncle, Midgley John Jennings, a Marine who served with distinction at the Battle of Camperdown, the naval battle off the Danish coast. A more likely role model, I think, was much closer to home, his cavalryman father. And if that's the case, then Keats's preoccupation with those significant dates of his father's death and funeral in later life start to make sense. Keats said he was always very careless about dates. Nothing could be further than the truth. He marked dates extremely carefully. The London Volunteer Cavalry had enabled Thomas Keats to consolidate his social presence, and likewise, his pugnacious eldest son mustered, not as a cavalryman, but as a poet, we are told, explicitly to exalt the family name. Keats's father had galloped out on a remarkably fine horse. His poet son would emulate the mythical horseman Bellerophon and be carried aloft by the winged horse Pegasus, described by Lempriere as the favourite of the Muses. And with luck, we've got an image here of Minerva presenting Pegasus to the warrior Bellerophon, just here. Unlike Bellerophon, whom Jupiter determined must be thrown down, and unlike his father Thomas, who fell with his horse, Keats was resolved to fix his eye on one horizon and arrive at his destination in the mouth of fame. Politically speaking, John Keats was a loyalist, albeit on the liberal side of the question. At the Isle of Wight in April 1817, he was, he said, disgusted by some extensive barracks, a nest of debauchery in so beautiful a place, and he promptly hurried on to Carisbrooke to commence Endymion, confident, as he said, that great things are to be gained by it. Now, I suggested in my biography, John Keats, A New Life, that Keats had deliberately travelled overnight to Southampton on the anniversary night of his father's death. He took the overnight coach on the 14th of April to make good the loss of his father by beginning his poetic campaign to gain on the following morning. And perhaps his phrase, "a nest of debauchery," reflects his awareness that a carouse with cavalry companions had cost Thomas Keats his life, as indeed Abbey later claimed. I find that Cavalier days are gone by, Keats informed his publisher on the 24th of April, 1818, steeling himself for a life of application, study, and thought that he deemed to be necessary for his poetry. "I find that I can have no enjoyment in the world," he said, "but continual drinking of knowledge." Having left all the trouble of Endymion to his publisher, who saw the book through the press, Keats meant to reassure John Taylor that he would be more focused, more reliable, and more responsible from then on. A position that Taylor's publishing partner, James Hesse, thought unlikely. That Keats was writing this letter on the 24th of April, one day after the anniversary of his father's funeral, allows us to see how Keats might have associated Cavalier days with memories of his father as a horseman whose Cavalier lifestyle had ended so tragically. The only drinking now foreseen by the poet was at fountains of knowledge rather than the bar at the Highbury barn. That Keats was indeed distancing Cavalier days while enlisting memories of his father in his poetic ambitions may explain phrases such as "a spur to wind up my poem" and "a great spur to speed proof corrections." Also significant in this respect is his letter to Fanny Brawne, written from Winchester on Monday the 16th of August, 1819. With no idle leisure, Keats tells Fanny that he feels in complete cue, in the fever, and shall in these 4 months do an immense deal. I am impelled, he says, I am driven to it. I am no officer in yawning quarters, he continues. I can no more use soothing words to you than if I were at this moment engaged in a charge of the cavalry. Ironically, exactly at this moment, on the 16th of August 1819, a volunteer cavalry regiment charged into the crowd at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester. And in a further strange coincidence, the crowd at St. Peter's Fields had gathered to listen to a speaker who was formerly of the Wiltshire Volunteer Cavalry, our old friend Henry Hunt, of course, now nicknamed Orator Hunt. And I think I've got some images of him here for you. Here he is in St. Peter's Field, addressing the crowd on the stage, such as it was. Brilliantly reenacted in Mike Leigh's film Peterloo, incidentally, if you haven't yet seen it. Here are some details of the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry Cavalry charging into the crowd. Hunt again in the back there, shouting. And here is a rather grisly detail from this Cruikshank cartoon. As he looked on from the tribune, the former cavalryman Henry Hunt would have been horribly aware of the damage that the Manchester and Salford militia was about to inflict. 1 month after that tragedy, in his poem To Autumn, Keats would contemplate the spirit of the season, and it's the lines down here that I'm going to read out. The spirit of the season. Sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow, sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe. I think what we have in these lines is, in little, if you like, a figurative emblem of Keats's life as a poet by laying aside the hook of his father's sabre and a life in the military. Keats enabled us to hear the lyrical beauty of his poetry with all its twined flowers. It seems to me that those 5 lines from To Autumn capture in miniature the choices Keats had as a poet and his decision to abandon the sabre or the hook for lyrical poetry. Keats's letter to Fanny Brawne explicitly linked his poetical effort to complete the last act of our tragedy, Otto the Great, to the forceful momentum of a cavalry charge. His aim, of course, was to get the play performed with Edmund Kean in the leading role, establish a reputation as a playwright, and above all, make money. "I am exalted," he wrote to John Taylor, "and look with hate and contempt upon the literary world." Sadly, and unlike the lyrical respite of To Autumn, Keats's words might all too readily be associated with the cavalrymen at Peterloo, galloping on horseback into a crowd they looked down upon as beneath contempt. "A drummer boy," Keats goes on to Taylor, "who holds out his hand familiarly to a field marshal. That drummer boy with me is the good word and favour of the public." No doubt John Taylor spotted the implication that in poetic terms, Keats was measuring up to be a field marshal. "Who would wish to be among the commonplace crowd of the little famous," he writes, "who are each individually lost in a throng made up of themselves?" I suspect that Keats's father had asked himself much the same question as he enlisted in the volunteer cavalry, thereby exalting himself above the throng as a gentleman, or as Abbey grudgingly said, a man of consequence. Well, as we look back over this curious story at the poet's bicentenary, we can see that the day young John Keats grabbed a naked sword marked one beginning of his career as a writer. His father's advance in society influenced Keats's childish role-playing, his dressing up like Lord Byron, and his subsequent decision to abandon medicine for poetry as a means to elevate himself above the commonplace crowd. Leigh Hunt tells us that when Keats was in the final phase of his medical career at Guy's Hospital, the idea for his poem "I Stood Tiptoe Upon a Little Hill" came to him as he stood beside the gate that leads from the Battery on Hampstead Heath into a field of Ken Wood. Now, the Battery was, of course, a gun emplacement. That gate beside a gun battery led to the melodious plot of poetry and ultimately to Keats's Italian voyage, embarked upon with the sensation of marching up against a battery. Bizarrely, a gun emplacement was associated with both the outset and the conclusion of Keats's poetic career. As we have seen, ideas of the cavalry, of campaigns, and of military rank were repeatedly linked with Keats's ambitions as a poet. And his stance before the public reflected a cavalryman's sense of social elevation, as was tragically demonstrated at Peterloo on the very day that Keats was comparing his intense creative energy as a poet to a cavalry charge. Ironically, too, the fact that his father never saw military action may be registered in the figurative world of several of his poems. His early couplet poems, for example, Specimen of an Induction and Calidore, are both attempts to initiate a tale of chivalry, a narrative poem that will tell the story of how the young knight Calidore is lifted, we are told, from the world's bleak promontory for deeds of glory. Swords and sabres are laid aside in these poems, however, and as Calidore is burning to hear of knightly deeds, the poem dwindles away into converse and finally falls asleep. It's at least possible, I think, that the demise of cavalryman Thomas may be linked to his son's poems of knightly inertia and inactivity, the specimen of an induction, Calidore, perhaps the loitering knight-at-arms in La Belle Dame sans Merci, certainly Ode on Indolence. Reflecting that his idea of achieving fame with Endymion seemed beyond his power of attainment, Keats said that he had once nearly consented to drop into a phaeton, that is, to abandon his poetic efforts for a comfortable and less demanding way of life. Yet he had rallied himself with the thought that 'tis a disgrace to fail even in a huge attempt. Perhaps in these words we can detect a memory of his father's fall from his fine horse, a disgrace and a failure for a cavalryman, certainly, and likewise for an ambitious young poet who faltered in a huge attempt. If I fail, I shall die hard, John Keats announced to Fanny Brawne, aware, no doubt, that to fail would be to fall, as his father had done, fatally distant from his destination. So, to draw all of this to some kind of conclusion, 200 years on, as we look back from 2021 at the strange cavalry charge of Keats's career and the many poems of genius that he felt himself impelled to create, we also notice scenes of inactivity, indolence, loitering, and drowsing, all moods conducive to the creation of poetry, rather than the Austrian broadsword exercise. We see how he surmounted tragedy and disease and poverty and the railings of reviews that some would argue were responsible for his early death. He surmounted all of that to arrive at last, not at Highbury Barn, and not at the artillery ground or Keats's livery stables, not arguably at Wentworth Place or at the Piazza di Spagna in Rome. I'd suggest that John Keats arrived at last, and as he had hoped, at his true home, where at the 200th anniversary of his death, he is exalted indeed, having taken the last stronghold among the English poets. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm pleased to say that Professor Rowe has said that he would be happy to take a few questions if anybody has anything that you would like to ask.
Hello, Rico. Is that you?
In your books, you've argued that Keats was a pugilist, but you don't mention anything like that in your lecture. Is there some reason for that?
Yes, well, that was a lifelong interest, if that's the right word for Keats, prize fighting and the long rounds of bare knuckle fighting that were actually illegal at the time, but could be conducted at places outside the city, such as Crawley, where Keats walked out to watch a famous fight that went to many, many rounds. So yes, I mean, I see this kind of militaristic, pugilistic aspect to Keats as a constant from his earliest days as a poet. He said that he was going to Scotland in summer of 1818 to strengthen his reach as a poet. And by that I think he means not just travelling 600 miles or so around the Highlands. I think he had in mind the idea of the reach of a boxer's punch, and that in some way, rather as he was comparing his creativity to a cavalry charge, he might in other moods have seen his energies as a creator as in some way linked with the energy of a boxing match. So it's a good question, and unquestionably something that he continued throughout his life.
Thank you. Anybody else?
It's nearly time for drinks.
Yep.